In the spring of 1980, a demolition crew ran charges through the walls of the largest private house ever demolished in America and brought it down in a single afternoon. 147 rooms, a palace larger than the White House, raised by the richest banker in Philadelphia and emptied by the wife who spent his $100 million on it, and on a way of living that could not outlast the money. Her name was Eva Stotesbury, and she was not the only one. Before her, a showgirl wore the most famous diamond on earth and died scrubbing floors. A barber's daughter spent $1 million in a single week and handed the language a new word for what she was. A great beauty kept hundreds of pairs of shoes and went without food sooner than go without her flowers. Another bought a whole opera house rather than earn one true note. 5 women. 5 of the greatest fortunes America ever built, and the same fire at the end of each of them. Before we walk into that fire, let me ask one thing of you. If you love the stories the history books tuck into a footnote, the women behind the great fortunes and the ruin behind the glamour, subscribe and stay with me, because this is a long one, and the best of it is near the end. Chapter 1. The fortunes built to outlast their builders. The men who built these fortunes believed they were building something that would stand for 100 years, and almost every one of them was wrong. They came out of the American century that ran roughly from the end of the Civil War to the edge of the Great War, the years a later age would call the Gilded Age, and they built the way pharaohs built, in a hurry and for eternity. They laid rail across a continent. They pressed tin plate by the millions of sheets and wove carpet by the mile and moved other men's money through marble halls and took a commission on all of it. They turned coke and steel and copper into cities. And when the money came, as it came in quantities the world had never seen collected in private hands, they did with it what frightened, ambitious, self-made men have always done. They tried to make it permanent. They built houses that looked like the country seats of English dukes. They bought the paintings off the walls of bankrupt European families. They married their daughters to men with titles and no cash, so that a granddaughter might be a countess, and the whole grubby business of how the money was made might be washed clean in a single generation. It is difficult now to feel the size of that money because our own age has grown used to fortunes, but set it in its own time. In the decades on either side of the year 1900, a skilled workman counted himself lucky to earn a modest wage for a long day's labor, and a comfortable family lived a whole year on what one of these great fortunes could burn through between breakfast and dinner. And into that world came private fortunes of 50, of 80, of $100 million and more, held by single families, incomes of millions a year rolling in whether the owner rose from bed or not. It was a concentration of wealth without precedent in the history of the Republic, and much of it was brand new, made in a single lifetime by men who had started with nothing, and who therefore had no inherited code for what one did with it, only the raw desire to be seen to have arrived. They spent to be seen. And more often than the family histories like to admit, the seeing and the spending were handed, in the second act, to their wives and their daughters. Look at where the 5 fortunes in this film were actually made, and you have a map of the whole American century laid out before you. There was English land and an old English name, money already crumbling before an American ever touched it. There was the raw desire of lumbermen and automobile men, converted into diamonds by a woman who had made herself the product they were buying. There was mining and mercantile money, entangled in a brutal marriage. There was carpet, woven by the mile in the mills of Yonkers, and the great harvesting machines that cut the wheat of a continent. And there was banking, the money that stood quietly behind all the other money, the House of Drexel and the House of Morgan, land and desire and mining and carpet and harvest and the bank. A half-dozen industries, 5 women, and 1 fire lit carefully underneath each of them. They believed the fortune was a thing you could hand down, like a watch. And in a sense they were right, because the money did pass down. What they did not reckon with was who it passed to, and what those people would do with it. Because a fortune is not a watch, a fortune is a fire. It is the most concentrated form of stored energy a human being can hold. And like any fire, it can warm a house or burn one to the ground. And the difference lies entirely in the hands that tend it. These men spent their lives gathering the fuel. They died believing they had built a hearth. What they had built, in more cases than the family histories like to admit, was a bonfire. And they handed the match to the very people the age had trained for nothing except to be decorative. That is the thread that runs through the 5 lives in this film. Each of these women came into one of the great American fortunes. Not one of them earned it in the counting house. They married it, or inherited the spending of it, or seized it out of the hands of a besotted man, and then each of them, in her own spectacular way, set the whole thing alight. One burned an estate that turned out to be half ash before she ever touched it. One burned husband after husband through a bathroom door. One burned 2 fortunes so quietly and so beautifully that the people who envied her never once saw the smoke. One burned tens of millions chasing a single high note. And one, the last and largest of them, burned $100 million building a palace so vast that when it finally came down, it took a demolition crew and a spring afternoon to do it. To understand how easy the burning was, you have to understand the machinery that stood ready to receive the money. There was the marriage market, first of all, a genuine international exchange in which American dollars were traded for European rank as openly as wheat was traded in Chicago. A dollar princess, the papers called such a girl, and the price of a duke was known to the mothers of New York the way the price of railway shares was known to their husbands. A daughter married well when she married a title, and the older and hungrier the title, the higher the American family paid, sometimes millions in cash and settlements to attach a coronet to the family name. It was a market like any other, with buyers and sellers and a going rate, and the goods on offer were young women. Then there were the jewel houses, and they matter more to this story than any other single institution, so keep them in view. There was Cartier in Paris, and there was Black, Star, and Frost on Fifth Avenue, and a little later the young Harry Winston, houses whose entire business was the conversion of paper fortunes into hard, portable, gleaming stones. And there was Joseph Duveen, the greatest art dealer of the age, who made his living on one simple observation, that Europe had the pictures and America had the money, and that he stood in the middle taking a commission on the flow. These were the temples where the new money went to be turned into something that felt like permanence, and watch the stones especially, because the stones are the other half of this story. A great diamond does not care who owns it. The Hope diamond and the Portuguese diamond and a certain great emerald and a golden yellow diamond moved through these women's lives like planets through a night, indifferent, luminous, permanent. And when each woman had burned through everything else, the stone simply moved on to the next hand. Hold that thought, because at the end of this film, every one of those stones will be sitting behind glass in a museum or an auction room, admired by strangers, priced higher than the estate it came out of, while the woman who bankrupted herself to wear it is a line of small type on the label. The fortunes were the fire. The jewels are what the fire could not touch. So this is not a film about foolish women, whatever the men who wrote the first drafts of their lives would have you believe. It is a film about what happens when an age builds fortunes it means to last forever, and hands the spending of them to daughters and wives it has trained to want everything and permitted to control almost nothing. The spending, you will come to see, was the one lever they were allowed to pull without limit, and they pulled it until the whole machine came apart in their hands. There is a ladder here, and we climb it from the smallest fortune to the largest, and from the gentlest fall to the most complete. We begin at the bottom, with a girl from a Pennsylvania hotel who married a lord and the most famous diamond in the world, refused a fortune to do it, and ended her days on her knees with a scrub brush, turned away from a relief job because she had traded her country for a coronet. Chapter 2. A showgirl marries a lord and a diamond. In the winter of 1893, an American music hall singer with a low, smoky voice married the man who owned the most famous diamond in the world, and for a few years she was one of the most envied women in England. Her name was May Yohe, and she had come a very long way to stand in that particular light. She was born in 1866 in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, the granddaughter of the man who kept the Eagle Hotel, the building that would one day become the Grand Hotel Bethlehem. She grew up, quite literally, inside a hotel, in the smell of other people's dinners and the sound of other people's arrivals, and her father was known around the town for a small, strange talent. Each Christmas, he built elaborate miniature villages on the hotel grounds, whole little worlds of painted houses and tiny streets, beautiful and pointless and gone by the new year. It is a hard image to shake once you have it, a childhood spent among perfect little worlds that were always taken down again. She was sent to Europe as a girl, to Dresden and to a convent in Paris, and she came back with a polish she would use for the rest of her life, and with an instrument that was genuinely her own. Her voice was a deep contralto, husky and low and small in range, so unusual that, as she herself put it, music had to be specially written for her, crammed, in her word, into the shrunken circumference of the notes she could actually reach. She made her stage debut in Philadelphia in 1886, not yet 20, and by the early 1890s she had crossed the Atlantic and become a real star of the London stage, the naughty, gaslit, champagne-soaked London of the 90s. She played the title parts in the popular burlesques of the day, in shows with names like The Lady Slavey and Little Christopher Columbus, and she was a sensation, a genuine draw, a woman whose deep, strange voice and easy warmth filled theatres. She became a favourite of Albert Edward, the Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII, and to the end of her life, the object she treasured most was a large signed photograph of him, inscribed simply, "To May," dated to the height of her fame. And then she met Lord Francis Hope. He was the heir to an old English name, in line for the Dukedom of Newcastle, and he was the owner of the Hope diamond, a great dark blue stone with a long and bloody legend attached to it. That diamond deserves a moment of its own, because it is the richest object in this film. It had begun, centuries before, as a huge rough stone brought out of India by a French merchant and sold to Louis XIV, cut into a great blue jewel called the French blue, and worn by the kings of France. It vanished in the chaos of the French Revolution, resurfaced in London a generation later, recut, and took its name at last from an English banking family, the Hopes, in whose collection it appeared in the 1830s. It had descended through the Hope family to reach the young man May Yohe now stood in front of. To an American showgirl from a hotel in Bethlehem, he was the top of the world, and she married him, quietly, at a register office in Hampstead in the last week of November 1893. With the marriage announced to the public the following spring, she became Lady Frances Hope. In her own words, she was on the way to becoming one of the proudest and richest duchesses in the British Empire. The Hope family was horrified. A titled family did not marry a music hall singer, and they moved to stop it in the most straightforward way they knew. They offered her money to go away, £200,000, a fortune that would be worth many millions today, simply to break the engagement and vanish. And here is the first thing to understand about May Yohe, the thing that separates her from a mere victim of circumstance. She refused. She looked at £200,000 in guaranteed cash, and she looked at the coronet and the diamond and the future duchess she meant to become, and she chose the coronet. It was the first great bet of her life, and like every bet she would ever make, she made it with her whole heart and against the odds. What she could not have known, standing there refusing a fortune, was that the fortune she was marrying into was already a ghost. This is the cruel joke buried at the centre of her story. Lord Francis Hope had come into his inheritance young, at 21, and he had gone through it at a speed that impressed even the spendthrifts of his own class. The Hope estates threw off an income worth well over $2 million a year in the money of today, a broad river of wealth, and he lived so far beyond even that river that in June of 1894, the very year his marriage to May was announced to the world, he filed for bankruptcy. The figures entered into the record were brutal. Liabilities of more than £400,000 against assets of under £200,000. She had refused a fortune to marry a man who owed more than he owned. In the first years of the marriage, it was her wages, the earnings of the music hall singer the family had tried to buy off, that helped pull the noble house partway back from the edge. The showgirl was keeping the lord. So the marriage only looked, from the outside, like a poor girl's triumphant capture of a rich lord. In truth, it was two people, one of them famous and earning, one of them titled and ruined, setting fire to what remained of an old estate together. And for a while, it was glorious. There were the great houses and the London seasons and the world tours, and there was, above all, the diamond, the object that has defined May Yohe in memory ever since. Here the record turns strange, and honesty requires us to stay inside what can be shown. May Yohe claimed, then and for the rest of her life, that she wore the Hope diamond, that the great cursed blue stone had hung at her own American throat. It is the heart of her legend. It may not be true. Lord Francis Hope himself, on the record, flatly denied it. He said that he had owned the stone since 1887, and that from that year, until he sold it in 1901, it was never worn by anyone at all, that it had sat tied up in a family trust, in a bank vault. The most careful modern historian of the diamond concludes that she may never once have worn the real thing, and that what she wore later, on the stage, was a paste copy, a piece of glass. Sit with that for a moment, because it is the most perfect detail in her whole life. The object she is remembered for wearing may be one she only ever wore in imitation and in story. She built her fame on a diamond she may have held only in the way we all hold the things we most want, which is to say, never quite. And the diamond, unlike the woman, had somewhere to go. Because the estate was collapsing, the stone had to be sold, and selling it required the permission of a court, since it was locked in trust. Lord Francis got his permission, and in 1901 he sold the Hope diamond to a London dealer for £29,000. It crossed the Atlantic soon after, its value on the customs papers set at a little over $140,000, though the newspapers, who never met a diamond they could not inflate, said $250,000. Whichever figure you believe, the stone was gone, out of the family, out of May Yohe's reach, off on its long journey toward the glass case in Washington where it sits today. She had married a fortune that was already ash, and now even the one hard, gleaming piece of it had slipped through her fingers. She was 35 years old, and the descent was only beginning. Chapter 3. The floors she ended up scrubbing. She gave up a coronet for a soldier she met on the last leg of a world tour, and every year after that took something else away from her. The soldier was Putnam Bradley Strong, an American Army officer, the son of a mayor of New York, a man with a good name and, as it turned out, a bad character. May met him in 1901 on the homeward stretch of a long tour she was making with her husband, and the affair that followed detonated everything she had left. There is a story, repeated in every account of her life, that Lord Francis himself encouraged Strong to escort his wife onward, that when May fell ill with pneumonia, her husband went off fishing in Florida while the young officer arrived at her bedside with flowers. Whether or not that is exactly how it happened, the outcome is not in doubt. She ran. She and Strong eloped, registering at a San Francisco hotel under a false name, husband and wife, until they were recognized and thrown out. Strong resigned his commission in the scandal. They fled across the Pacific to Yokohama and lived there for months, and May Yohe, who had refused £200,000 to keep a lord, walked away from the lord and the title and everything the marriage still notionally contained, for the sake of a man she summed up, in the pun she is most quoted for, by saying that it was because she got tired of hope that she became strong. She had chosen with her whole heart again, and again the bet went bad, faster this time. Strong, it emerged, was a good deal worse than feckless. He was predatory. In Japan, he took her jewels, thousands of dollars of them, the last portable remnant of the great marriage, and he vanished, leaving behind a note claiming he meant to shoot himself. She cried out, in a line the papers seized on, that he had left her nothing, that all her jewels were gone. She organized a manhunt to find him. And then, when he sent her a begging letter hinting again at suicide, she took him back, saying that he could have everything she had if he would only come back to her. There is the whole of May Yohe in that reversal, robbed by a man, and racing to forgive him the moment he threatened to harm himself. They married in Buenos Aires in the autumn of 1902, once her divorce from Lord Francis was final. They went on the stage together, a novelty act, a real fallen Lady Hope, and at their peak they earned as much as $750 a week. And then, 3 years later, Strong went bankrupt, and in the same month she filed to divorce him for desertion. Her own verdict on the whole affair was as clear-eyed as anything ever said about her. She realized, she said, that she had made a terrible fool of herself, and that she had lost everything. Everything, it turned out, still had further to fall. What followed was a long, grinding subsidence, decade after decade, each one taking her lower. There were more marriages, to a journalist, to a musician, and finally to a South African army captain named Smuts, a cousin of the famous general, the man who would stay with her to the end. There was a boarding house in Seattle. There was a child, born in Oregon and given up for adoption, signed away under a borrowed name, a whole hidden chapter she buried and rarely spoke of. By 1908, she was singing in a cheap music hall in Sacramento, in her own bleak phrase, for daily bread, wearing the paste copy of the diamond she may never have owned, under the footlights of a 10-cent house. By 1911, she was in Chicago, in what one account calls dire penury, close to starvation. With Captain Smuts, she tried a chicken farm, a tea plantation, a rubber plantation, a California ranch, a farm in New Hampshire, and each of them failed. And each failure was a rung, and each rung was lower than the last. By the middle 1920s, she was in Boston, where her husband worked as a janitor, and where she herself, the woman who had refused a fortune to become a duchess, is reported to have scrubbed floors in a steamship yard. She did one thing in those years that shows the fight was never quite out of her, and it is the sharpest turn in her story. She took the one asset she had left, which was the legend, and she sold it. The Hope diamond by now had acquired a reputation as a cursed stone, a bringer of ruin to its owners, and it is worth being exact about that reputation, because it is younger than people think. There is no ancient curse. The story of the cursed Hope diamond first appears in an American newspaper in 1908, years after the stone had left the Hope family, and it was fed and fattened deliberately by the jeweller Pierre Cartier, who found that a cursed diamond was easier to sell than a merely beautiful one, and who used the legend to help place the stone with an American heiress named Evelyn Walsh McLean. The curse, in other words, was marketing. And May Yohe, who had lost everything after her years near the diamond, decided to become the living proof of that marketing and to charge admission for it. In 1921, she starred, as herself, in a 15-part motion picture serial called The Hope Diamond Mystery, supplying the studio with her own life as the raw material, playing a showgirl who marries a lord, watches him gamble away the diamond fortune, and deserts him. She scripted her own scandal and sold tickets to it. The serial gave a young actor named Boris Karloff one of his first real parts, and the studio spent $100,000 on a single temple set for it. There was a book. There was a stage act built on the curse. The stone she may never have truly worn became, in the end, the only thing she had left to sell, and she sold the story of it because she no longer had the thing itself. Follow that arc, because it is the whole of her, the diamond as ornament, then as alibi, then as merchandise. And then came the last humiliation, the one that gathers her whole life into a single sheet of paper. It was 1938, in Boston, in the depths of the Depression. Captain Smuts was ailing. There was no money. And so May Yohe, who had once turned down £200,000, went to a government relief office to apply for a clerical job under the Works Progress Administration, a job that paid $16.50 a week. She was turned down. She was turned down because she was not an American citizen. 40-odd years before, to marry Lord Francis Hope, she had given up her American citizenship, and now, at the very bottom, she discovered that she was a foreigner in her own country, that the coronet she had chased and lost had cost her even the right to be poor here. She had to reapply for her citizenship and be naturalized again in the spring of 1938, before she was permitted to take a relief job at $16.50 a week. Picture that single sheet of paper, the application, the clerk, the stamp. It holds her entire life, the diamond and the lord and the affairs and the plantations and the ruin, folded down into one page in a relief office. She died in Boston a few months later, in the late summer of 1938, of heart and kidney disease, 72 years old. 3,000 people are said to have come to her funeral, a strange last crowd for a woman who had died with nothing. Her husband scattered her ashes, as she had asked, into the Atlantic. She left behind almost nothing, a few clippings, the memory of a voice, and the signed photograph of a prince who had been dead for nearly 30 years. For a long time after, she was remembered only as a footnote to a diamond, one name in the string of owners the curse was said to have ruined, her own long life swallowed whole by the legend she had helped to sell. In the town where she was born, they tell it a little differently. They say her ghost still walks the hotel that stands today where her grandfather's hotel once stood. The girl, who grew up among the little painted Christmas villages that were always taken down again, come home at last to the one place that never demolished her. It is only a story, no more than that. But of all the women in this film, she is the one who most deserves a haunting, because she is the one the world came closest to forgetting entirely, and a ghost, whatever else it is, at least refuses to be forgotten. May Yohe burned an estate that was already half gone before she ever touched it, and she paid for it with a completeness that none of the women who follow her would quite match, because none of them fell as far. The next woman on the ladder did not marry a ghost of a fortune. She took whole fortunes, real and liquid, out of the hands of living men, and she burned them faster, and she did it without a shred of the romantic illusion that undid May Yohe. She never once pretended it was love. Chapter 4. The Barber's Daughter, Who Priced Herself. She was born over a barber's shop in Virginia, and she decided early that beauty was the only capital she would ever be given, so she learned to sell it at the highest price the market would bear, again and again, for the rest of her life. Her name became Peggy Hopkins Joyce, and she is the woman who taught America a phrase it still uses without knowing where it came from. She was born Emma Marguerite Upton in 1893 in a small town near Norfolk, the daughter of a barber. There was no fortune anywhere near her cradle. There was a pretty face, a quick instinct for men, and a complete absence of the illusions that undid May Yohe. Where May chased love and lost fortunes, Peggy chased fortunes and never once pretended otherwise. And that clarity is the engine of her whole story. She ran away as a girl of about 15 with a vaudeville performer, and on a train she met the first of the men she would marry. Even her name is an artifact of the spending. Hopkins and Joyce were the surnames of her second and third husbands, and she stitched them together into a permanent brand and wore it long after both men were gone, a kind of trophy rack made of surnames. She reached New York and the stage, and in 1917 she appeared in the Ziegfeld Follies, the great glittering review of the age, a parade of beautiful women in beautiful clothes, and she earned $700 a week at a time when a working man might make a fraction of that in a month. She could not really sing, and she could not really dance, and it did not matter in the slightest, because what she had was presence. The ability to stand still in a beautiful gown and make a theatre full of people forget to breathe. That was the whole of her art, and it was enough. She was, in the deepest sense, a professional object of desire, and she understood the profession better than the men who thought they were running it. She learned which jewels caught the light, which men could be made to compete for her, which photographs sold papers. By the early 1920s, she was one of the most written about women in America, famous, in the phrase a later century would recognize instantly for being famous, the celebrity of pure surface, pure appetite, pure consumption. She wrote a gossip column under her own name. She turned the mere fact of her existence, the clothes she wore and the men she was seen beside, into a career, and she did it a full century before the world had settled on a word for the trade. When people today reach for a comparison, they reach for the celebrities famous for being famous, and they are right, because Peggy Hopkins Joyce built that particular machine first, out of nothing but a face and an unshakable nerve. The husbands came in a line, and the line tells the story. There were 6 of them. The first was a Denver man she married at about 16, a union annulled almost at once when he discovered how young she was. The second was a Washington lawyer named Hopkins, married in 1913, left behind when the stage called. But the one that matters, the one that made her legend, was the third, a Chicago lumber millionaire named Stanley Joyce, whom she married in January of 1920. For roughly 18 months, this man poured his fortune over her, and the record sets out what that meant in figures that are hard to take in even now. $1,400,000 in jewelry, a house in Miami worth $300,000, furs, motor cars, land, more of everything, on and on. And 2 moments from that single marriage have outlived everyone who witnessed them, because together they are the purest portrait we have of what Peggy Hopkins Joyce actually was. The first is the shopping. Newly married, turned loose on the shops of Manhattan with a rich man's credit behind her, she spent close to $1 million in a single week. Say that slowly. In 7 days, a barber's daughter spent, on herself, a sum worth very many times over in the money of today, and she spent it the way another woman might spend an idle afternoon, without strain, without apparent pleasure even, simply because the money was there, and the spending was the thing she did, the one thing she had trained herself to do without limit or hesitation. The second moment is smaller and darker and more perfect, and it has been told and retold for a century because it is so exactly right. On their wedding night, the story goes, the new bride locked herself in the bathroom and refused to come out until her husband produced a check for $500,000 and slid it, or the promise of it, to her through the door. Whether it happened in precisely that way or not, it is the truest thing anyone ever said about her, because it puts the transaction in its proper place, physically, in the doorway, between the woman and the marriage bed, love meted out in 6 figures before the marriage was even consummated. The marriage ended, as all of them did, and the ending is instructive too. The divorce settlement is recorded 2 ways, either $600,000 and $1,500 a month for the rest of her life, or, by another account, a full $2 million, and the disagreement in the record is itself part of the legend, the figures so large that even the newspapers of the day could not keep them straight. What is agreed is that Stanley Joyce, the lumber millionaire, came out of 18 months of marriage to Peggy Hopkins. Joyce a wrecked man, his fortune gutted, filing for bankruptcy, while she moved on, richer, more famous, and entirely unbothered, to the next. There was a Swedish count after Joyce, a real title at last, a marriage that lasted about 6 weeks before she left him. Though of that one, and of that one alone, she said that all her other marriages had meant nothing, and that this was the first time she had ever truly been in love. She said it of a marriage that lasted 6 weeks, and there would be 2 more husbands late in her life, of steadily diminishing wealth, the lumber king giving way at last to a retired bank official, so that the descent of the husbands became the arc of her whole life in miniature, from millionaire to count to clerk. The market for her beauty softening year by year, and Peggy adjusting her price to it, with the cold accuracy of a broker reading a falling stock. And money on that scale does not come only from marriage. Peggy had other sources, the chief of them the desire of very rich married men, which she converted into hard assets with the efficiency of a foundry. The automobile titan Walter Chrysler, a married man and a father of 4, is recorded lavishing on her something like $2 million in jewelry, including a diamond necklace of 134 carats that cost around $500,000, and a pair of Italian motor cars worth $45,000 between them. She took the wanting of powerful men and turned it into diamonds and automobiles, and then she wore the diamonds and drove the automobiles, and then, in time, she sold them all, because a woman who lives on her beauty is living on a wasting asset, and Peggy Hopkins Joyce, whatever else she was, always knew to the penny what she was worth on any given day. Chapter 5. The Men Who Did Not Survive Her. In Paris, in the spring of 1922, a man shot himself over her, and 8 days later, a second man tried to. The first was a Chilean diplomat named Heiresses, who put a bullet in himself on the 1st of May and died of it. The second, another Chilean attaché, took poison a little over a week later and was found, so the story runs, clutching a newspaper that carried her printed declaration of love. In the middle of it all, she herself swallowed an overdose of sleeping pills and survived, and the papers of 2 continents could not get enough of any of it. This is the darker weather that hung around Peggy Hopkins Joyce, and she was not sentimental about it. Of the men she ruined, she said, in a line that should be carved somewhere, that she had dangled this one on a string just as she had many others, and then, almost as an afterthought, wondered aloud why she did it, and swore she never meant to ruin their lives. It is as close to remorse as she ever came, and even that she said with a shrug, the way a person recounts weather. She had lovers whose names were an index of the age, a Greek prince, a French newspaper baron, one of the great American statesmen of the century, an Indian Maharaja, and Charlie Chaplin, whose film A Woman of Paris is said to draw on her, and on whose schooner she sailed out to Catalina in the bright centre of the 1920s. She was written into songs by Cole Porter, who name-checked her 3 separate times in 3 different lyrics, and by Rodgers and Hart, who put it plainly that Peggy Joyce had a business, and that all her husbands had gold. The novelist Zora Neale Hurston, reaching for the very highest standard of self-regard she could imagine, wrote that Peggy Joyce had nothing on her. That is how completely woven into the culture this woman was, that a great writer measured her own confidence against Peggy Hopkins Joyce, and a Broadway team rhymed her marriages into a hit, and a film comedian built a heroine out of her. She was the age of excess made flesh, and the performance had one recurring prop, one object above all others that carried her whole philosophy, and that object was a diamond. It was called the Portuguese diamond, a flawless octagonal stone of 127 carats, famous for a strange quality that will matter before this chapter ends, a cold blue fire that glows faintly in the dark under the right light. Its royal Portuguese name was pure invention, marketing dreamed up to lend a stone, dug out of a South African mine, a European pedigree it never had, which is fitting, since Peggy dealt in exactly that sort of invention herself, a manufactured aura sold at a premium. In February of 1928, she acquired it from the Fifth Avenue House of Black, Star and Frost, trading in a pearl necklace worth $350,000 and adding cash on top. And she had the great stone mounted on a collar of diamonds and platinum, and she wore, at her own throat, what the jewelers of her day called the largest perfect diamond in the world. Take the full measure of that. A barber's daughter, self-made out of nothing but a face and a nerve of steel, wearing the largest perfect diamond in the world to a party, on a neck that had been born over a barber's shop in Virginia. There is the whole American century in a single image, the rawest ambition and the highest polish sitting together on one throat. There is one more thing about that diamond, and it belongs to the eerie register that shadows the whole of her life. The Portuguese diamond glows. Under the right light, it gives off a cold blue fire in the dark, a faint and almost unearthly luminescence that sets it apart from any ordinary stone. And there is something fitting, something almost too apt to be true, in the fact that the one object Peggy Hopkins Joyce is remembered for wearing is a diamond that goes on burning quietly in the dark, long after the lights of the party have gone down. Men destroyed themselves in her orbit, one after another, a suicide in Paris, another attempt 8 days behind it, and she moved on from each of them untouched, luminous, cold, glowing faintly like the stone at her throat. There was no curse in it, only a trick of the light and a hard woman who had trained herself young to feel very little. but the image lingers all the same. Her own creed, delivered through the ghost-written pages of a memoir she published in 1930, was that true love was a heavy diamond bracelet, and best of all, one that still had the price tag on it. She meant it as a joke, and she meant it entirely. In the same book, she wrote that love was horrible and disgusting rather than beautiful and romantic, and she laid out her requirements for a husband with the precision of a purchasing agent drawing up a specification. Chief among them, that he rise first in the morning and shave before she was obliged to look at him. Because it was, she said, very tiring to have to look at a husband early in the day. She had worked out, long before she ever wrote it down, that the market for her beauty was finite and quietly closing, and she priced accordingly, and she never once let a man see her flinch or heard herself apologize. The market closed on her slowly, the way it always does. Her fame peaked in the 1920s, and then the 20s ended and took her moment with them. Her last appearance on the great vaudeville stage of the palace came in 1931, in an act that carried, with a bleakness she may or may not have intended, the title Rings on Her Fingers. Her film career, which had run to a scattering of pictures over the years, sputtered out after a comedy in 1933, in which she played, at the last, herself, which was the only part she had ever truly performed. And through the long decline of the 1930s and 40s, she did what May Yohe did, though she started from a far greater height. She sold the jewels and the furs, one by one, to live on. The Portuguese diamond itself she sold, in 1951, to the young jeweller Harry Winston, and Winston in turn, in 1963, handed it to the Smithsonian in exchange for 3,800 carats of smaller stones. And so the largest perfect diamond in the world, the crown of a barber's daughter, passed at last into a glass case in Washington, where it sits today, glowing its cold blue fire for school children who have never once heard the name of the woman who wore it. She died in 1957, 64 years old, of throat cancer, and the plainest summary of her end is also the truest, that she died overweight, poor, and obscure. The largest perfect diamond in the world, long since sold off to pay for the ordinary daily business of staying alive. She left one thing behind that outlasted the diamond, and it was a word. Around 1920, in connection with exactly the kind of life she led, American slang produced the phrase gold digger, and it was Peggy Hopkins Joyce, more than any other single woman alive, who gave it a face and a shape. That is her monument. Not a house, not a foundation, not a grave that anyone visits, but a phrase that every English speaker still uses, usually without a thought for the flesh and blood woman who priced her own beauty so exactly and spent the takings so completely that she made herself the very definition of the word. She is remembered, and she is remembered entirely on her own terms, as the woman who dug and dug deep, and never once in her life apologized for the digging. Peggy Hopkins Joyce spent for the sake of spending, coldly, knowing exactly what she was doing and exactly what it was worth to the last dollar. The next woman on the ladder spent for something far harder to name and far harder to buy. She spent 2 whole fortunes in pursuit of a single impossible thing, perfection, caring nothing for the jewels themselves or the men who gave them, and it cost her more than it ever cost Peggy, because there is no bottom to the price of that. Chapter 6. The most picturesque woman in America. She spent more money than any member of a royal household, and she never once bought anything vulgar. That paradox is Rita de Acosta Lydig, and it is the reason her ruin is the most beautiful and the most quietly devastating in this whole film. Where Peggy Hopkins Joyce burned fortunes for the pleasure and the leverage of it, Rita burned 2 fortunes in the service of an ideal, the ideal of absolute beauty, refined past the point any income could sustain, until the refinement itself consumed everything she had, quietly, elegantly, completely. She was born in New York in 1875, the eldest daughter of a large family of Spanish and Cuban descent, Catholic, proud, and set slightly apart from the Anglo-Dutch families who ruled New York society, and she made that difference into a lifelong performance of Spanishness, the mantillas, the fans, the pallor of an El Greco saint. Hers was a remarkable family. Her youngest sister was Mercedes de Acosta, the poet who would become famous as the lover of Greta Garbo and Marlene Dietrich, and who would end her days as the keeper of Rita's memory, the author of the memoir that preserves half of what we know of her. Another sister was among the first women anywhere to pilot a powered aircraft. But it was Rita who was the beauty, and the beauty was no ornament to her life. It was the central fact of it, discussed by the artists of her day, the way scholars discuss a masterpiece, in the language of awe. The painter Helou said she possessed 39 of the 40 cardinal points of beauty, and that only her colouring lacked warmth, that she was flawless and cold, pale as carved alabaster. The sculptor MacMonnies called her a perfected personality, a masterpiece of civilization, and John Singer Sargent gave the verdict that has followed her ever since. When a friend asked why so beautiful a woman never expressed herself in any art, Sargent answered simply, "She herself is art." She was painted by Boldini in a gown of silver, sculpted by Rodin, photographed by every great camera of the age. Poets, it was said in her own time, fell at her feet, and she moved through a salon that gathered the painters and the composers and the statesmen of 2 continents. To be painted by these men was itself a kind of spending, and she spent lavishly on being seen. The Italian master Boldini painted her again and again, most famously in a gown of shimmering silver, a portrait that would itself be sold off to a Rothschild once the money was gone. She sat for the great sculptors and the finest photographers of the age, and each portrait was a small immortality purchased against a face she knew, better than anyone alive, would not last forever. That is the thing to understand about all of her spending, the shoes and the gowns and the flowers and the sittings alike. She was racing time. She was pouring 2 whole fortunes into the single project of fixing a perfect and perishable thing, her own beauty, into something that would outlast it. And the terrible joke of her life is that she succeeded, that the beauty is fixed forever now in oil and marble and silver print, and that she had to be ruined first and dead before the fixing was complete. She married money twice and spent it in ways that make even Peggy Hopkins Joyce look thrifty, because Peggy at least bought things that held their value. Rita bought perfection, and perfection holds nothing at all. Her first husband was William Earl Dodge Stokes, heir to a mining and mercantile fortune, and the builder of a great New York apartment house, whom she married at 19 and divorced 5 years later, in 1900, walking away with a settlement recorded as close to $2 million, said at the time to be the largest divorce payment on record in America. There was a shadow under that marriage, a real and ugly one. Years later, in a courtroom, she testified that Stokes had beaten her during their years together, struck her, in her account, with a jacket heavy with buttons. So the flight into a world of perfect, silent, beautiful objects was, at least in part, a flight from a brutal man, and it is a thing to hold on to as the shoes and the gowns and the flowers accumulate through this chapter, because they were not vanity alone. They were the armour of a woman who had learned, the hard way, that beautiful things at least would never raise a hand to her. Her second husband was Philip Lydig, a wealthy retired officer, and the Lydig money funded the grandest phase of her life. There was a house on East 52nd Street, designed by Stanford White himself, the most fashionable architect in America. All veined marble and red velvet and old Venetian damask, with a Flemish tapestry 4 centuries old hanging in the dining room. There was a collection of medieval and Renaissance art assembled with the advice of the greatest dealers in the world. And there was, above all, the endless, ruinous, patient pursuit of the perfect object. The shoes are the truest window into her, so look at them closely, because a whole soul is visible in them. They were made by an Italian craftsman working in Paris who called himself the most expensive shoemaker in the world and took only a tiny handful of clients, and Rita was his greatest patron by far. She owned, by the careful modern count of the museum that holds them, at least 150 pairs, and by the memory of Cecil Beaton, who worshipped her, as many as 300, and this for a woman who, by every account, walked only very short distances in her life. Each shoe, with its wooden tree inside it, weighed, in Beaton's phrase, no more than an ostrich feather. Many were built from antique lace that Rita supplied from her own collection, the fabric of one treasure cut down to make another. She kept them in trunks of Russian leather made in St. Petersburg, heavy, locked, lined in cream velvet, each single shoe resting in its own little cradle, and each pair took 2 or 3 years to make and demanded a deposit of $1,000 before the work even began. There is a legend, told by her own sister, that the shoe trees were carved from antique violins for the lightness and the resonance of the wood, and it is a beautiful story, and it is false. The museum has shown the trees to be ordinary mahogany, but the fact that people believed it, and wanted so badly to believe it, tells you exactly what kind of aura this woman carried through the world. And it was not only shoes. She dressed at the house of Callot-Soeurs in Paris, in gowns so daring that one bare-backed evening dress became the stuff of newspaper cartoons, and a single account for her clothing, covering just 7 months of 1 year, ran to nearly 250,000 francs and ended up being fought over in a courtroom. She travelled to the Paris Ritz with a retinue, a hairdresser, a masseuse, a chauffeur, a secretary, a maid, and 40 Louis Vuitton trunks. And she spent, on fresh white flowers alone, something like $1,000 every month, filling her rooms with them, banking them against the walls, because she could not, she said, live without them. It is here that she gave the world the line that holds her whole soul, the line to keep in your mind through everything that follows, because it will come back at the very end. She said that she could go without food, but that she would not be without her white flowers. A woman who would sooner starve than surrender the white flowers is a woman who has already decided, long before the money runs out, exactly what she is willing to burn for. And Rita de Acosta Lydig had decided very early, and she never once wavered from it all the way down. Chapter 7. The Auction of a Life. For 16 years before the end, she was quietly selling the beautiful things, and almost no one who envied her ever knew. That is the secret buried inside Rita de Acosta Lydig's magnificence, that the burning was continuous, that even at the height of her glory, in the middle of the great marriage, in the very years the photographs remember and the artists immortalized, she was already feeding her possessions into the fire to keep the fire alive. The proof is on the record, in an auction house, and the date will surprise you. As early as 1913, still married, still counted among the rich, still at the summit of her fame, she stood at the Plaza Hotel and sold off 178 lots of her Gothic and Renaissance treasures for a total of some $362,000, a sum worth many millions today. The scholar who had catalogued the collection, a curator from the Metropolitan Museum, was appalled to discover she meant to use his learned catalogue as a sales book, and said as much for the record that had he known she meant to sell, he would have refused the work altogether. The great dealer Duveen bought the top lot, a Flemish tapestry, for $41,000, and it hangs in a museum to this day. But the point is the date. She needed the money already, in 1913, 16 years before her death, to feed the way she lived. Her rare books went at another sale a few years later. The burning never stopped. It only accelerated, quietly, year after year, until it reached the bottom. There was one last love in those years, and it deepened the ruin rather than relieving it. In 1921, divorced twice over, she became engaged to a well-known New York clergyman, the rector of a fashionable church, and for a moment it seemed she might marry a third time and steady herself against a man of substance. But the bishop of the diocese refused to permit the marriage, on the ground that she was a divorced woman with 2 living former husbands, and the engagement broke apart under the weight of the refusal. When the clergyman died a few years later, he was said to have left her the whole of his personal fortune, and the grief of it, and the spending that came after the grief, are tied by more than one account to the final unravelling of her money. She had spent 2 fortunes on beauty. Now she spent a third on mourning, and there was nothing left underneath it to catch her when she fell. The bottom came in 1927. She filed for bankruptcy, with debts of around $94,000, and that spring her possessions, the residue of 2 fortunes, the shoes and the gowns and the last of the art, were auctioned off, and her creditors received something like 40 cents on every dollar she owed them. One newspaper of the day recorded the reality behind the glamour with brutal plainness, that she had become so reduced that she could no longer pay her servants, that the grocers and the dressmakers and the laundries, all the trades that keep a fashionable life running, had buried her in accounts long past due. She published a small novel that same year about what she called the tragic futility of fashionable life, and pledged whatever it earned to the people she owed. And out of the entire wreck of her possessions, the record says that one single object was spared from the auction block. It was her son's silver christening mug. Everything else, the shoes light as feathers in their velvet cradles, the gowns from Paris, the medieval tapestries, all of it went under the hammer to strangers, and the child's small silver cup was the one thing in the world she would not let them sell. She was already dying as it happened. She had suffered all her life from a frail constitution, a stomach that could bear almost nothing, so little that a grandchild remembered 2 spoonfuls of soup and a few leaves of lettuce counting as her whole dinner. And now, a wasting anemia was finishing what a lifetime of denial had begun. She died in the autumn of 1929, in a rented room in a Fifth Avenue hotel, 54 years old, her estate worth at most $100,000, willed toward charity and education. The timing is almost too neat to be true, and yet it is entirely true. She died within days of the Wall Street crash, the last and most refined creature of the whole gilded aesthetic, expiring at the very hour that the moneyed world which had made her possible came crashing down around every ear in America. There is an eerie thread that runs under her story, and honesty asks that we hold it up to the light and then let the light pass through it. The painters and sculptors who adored her kept returning, over and over, to the same single word, alabaster, and one of them actually rendered her likeness in that cold white stone. Hellu's verdict, that only her colouring lacked warmth, that she was flawless and chill, reads now like a description of a funerary statue, as if the age had recognised in her, while she was still alive and walking through its salons, something already monumental and already gone. There is nothing supernatural in it. A woman can be pale and remote and beautiful without being any kind of ghost, and the mind, looking back across the years, loves to find omens where there was only illness and a certain style of face. But the pattern is unsettling all the same. A living woman so perfect and so cold that her own admirers kept sculpting her as though she were already a tomb effigy. And then she died. On the very day the world she embodied died with her. And so we come to the single image that holds the whole of Rita de Acosta Lydig, the image to set beside May Yohe's relief form. It is a deathbed in a rented hotel in the autumn of 1929. The most picturesque woman in America is dying with nothing. Her possessions scattered under the hammer for pennies, everything gone but a child's silver cup. Her sister Mercedes sits beside her and fans her in the warm room, and the great Spanish beauty, half conscious now, surfaces one last time and asks about the only object near her face. "Is it a Spanish fan?" she asks. That is the last of her, the woman who spent 2 fortunes turning her life into a work of art, checking, at the very edge of death, that even her dying was being done in the right style, in the right taste, with the right object at hand. And somewhere across town, in a warehouse, waiting out the years, were the shoes, each one still cradled in its velvet, in its Russian leather trunk, light as an ostrich feather, worth, all of them together, a great deal more than she died with. Those shoes are in a museum now, and the way they came to be there is its own small parable. Her sister Mercedes kept them, and the gowns and the mantillas with them, all through the lean years, and gave them at last to a great museum, which is the only reason you can stand in front of them today. They are catalogued now and conserved and displayed under careful light, each single one still resting in the velvet cradle its maker built for it, and they are studied as objects of art, which is exactly what Rita de Acosta Lydig always insisted they were. She was right in the end about the shoes. She was right about very nearly all of it. The one thing she was wrong about was the price, which turned out to be everything she had, and her life on top of it. Rita de Acosta Lydig burned 2 whole fortunes chasing a thing that cannot be bought at any price, beauty without a single flaw, and she did it so quietly and so beautifully that the smoke never showed above the rooftops. The next woman burned more than all of them, tens of millions of dollars, and she did it chasing something even less attainable than perfect beauty. She was chasing a sound. She was chasing a single true note that her own throat would never, in 50 years of trying and spending and being pelted for it, agree to give her. Chapter 8. 6 Husbands and an Opera House. She invented her own name out of the word for a waltz, and then she set about making the world believe she could sing, and the making of that belief cost more money than most small kingdoms hold. Her name, the name she invented, was Ganna Walska, and she is the woman who bought everything a fortune can buy except the one thing she actually wanted. She was born Hanna Puach in 1887, in a town then inside the Russian Empire, to a family of landowners, and she arrived in America around the time of the Great War as a complete reinvention of herself, a Polish coloratura soprano with a mysterious past and a genius for marriage. Even the name was a fiction she was proud of. She said that, like all Poles, she loved to dance, and above all, to waltz, and so out of the waltz, the valse, she made Walska. The name, she admitted cheerfully, was invented, born in an emergency. That is the key to the whole of her. She invented a name, she invented a past, she invented an age, keeping, it was said, a drawer full of passports with different birth dates written in them, and above all she invented, and then spent a lifetime and several fortunes trying to make real a great singer who did not exist. She styled herself an enemy of the average, and her whole creed, for a life and for a garden alike, came down in the end to 3 plain words: more is better. The fortunes came, as they came for all these women, through marriage, and Ganna Walska married on an industrial scale. There were 6 husbands in all. The first was a young Russian officer, a brief early match that left her little but the habit of the thing. The second was a distinguished New York doctor, some 20 years her senior, whose death in 1920 left her a first inheritance of over $300,000, her first real taste of what a well-chosen deathbed could do for a woman with ambitions and a growing appetite. But it was the third and the fourth husbands who truly built the pyre, and their names are worth knowing. The combined wealth standing behind her richest husbands ran to something like $125 million, and while she never held all of that at any one moment, she drew from it over the years settlements and gifts and inheritances on the order of tens of millions, and she burned through every last bit of it. To grasp the sheer scale of her personal spending, one figure will do the work of 100. She once arrived in New York for a short visit, carrying $2 million in clothes and jewels, and when the customs men tried to tax that cargo at a duty of a full $1 million, she fought them through the courts on an argument about her residency, and she won, and kept the lot. The argument she won it on is worth a word, because it shows the wit that ran underneath the extravagance. She fought the duty by claiming that she was not truly a resident of the United States at all, and so could not be taxed as one on her own wardrobe, a piece of clever legal footwork that turned the very narrowness of a married woman's legal position into a shield for $2.5 million in gowns and jewels. And what jewels they were! There was a great engraved emerald weighing more than 200 carats, a yellow diamond cut in the shape of a briolette that was one of only 2 of its kind then known in the world, ropes of pearls, a whole menagerie of Cartier. She wore fortunes on her body the way another woman wears a winter coat, and she carried them back and forth across the borders of the world as though the borders themselves were a small personal inconvenience. And more often than not, she was proven right. The third husband was Alexander Smith Cochran, the carpet millionaire, a man the newspapers of the day called the richest bachelor in the world, heir to a fortune once estimated at $40 million. He proposed, it is said, on the very day they met, married her in 1920, and was free of her again within about 2 years, at a cost of $3 million in the settlement alone, to say nothing of the string of Cartier bracelets and the sable coat worth £1 million, and the great yellow diamond he had draped on her along the way. Her verdict on him was as economical as anything Peggy Hopkins Joyce ever managed at her very coldest. Alec, she said, turned out to be the most miserable man she had ever met, and with that she pocketed the $3 million and moved on to the next and greater conquest. The fourth husband was the one who mattered, the enabler of the whole doomed dream, Harold Fowler McCormick, heir to the vast international harvester fortune, a serious patron of grand opera, and the man who set out, with the bottomless patience of the very rich, to buy his wife the career her voice could never earn her. He divorced a daughter of John D. Rockefeller himself in order to marry her. He spent thousands upon thousands of dollars on her voice lessons, engaging the finest teachers that money could hire in 2 countries. And in 1922, to give her a stage entirely her own, he saw to it that she could buy an entire Paris opera house, the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées, so that a woman the professionals would not hire could simply hire herself, night after night, on a stage she owned outright. There is no purer image anywhere in this whole film of what these vast fortunes actually made possible. A voice the world would not pay a single franc to hear, installed by the sheer brute force of money onto a great stage that its owner had purchased whole and entire. McCormick's devotion ran to lengths that belong in the eerie register as much as the financial one, and it measures the strange gravity this woman exerted on the men around her. 2 months before he married the younger Walska, this man of about 50 submitted himself in a Chicago hospital to an operation meant to make him young again, a gland transplant, at a cost of $50,000, performed by a surgeon whose stated motto was that a man is only as old as his glands. The popular name for the procedure, the monkey gland, is a simplification the surgeon himself flatly denied, and precisely what tissue was used remains genuinely unclear to this day, so leave that verdict open. But hold the picture, because it tells you everything about the force this small Polish woman exerted, a titan of American industry surgically remaking his own aging body to keep pace with a younger wife whose art he was, at the very same time and out of the very same fortune, financing straight into public humiliation. After McCormick, there would be 2 more husbands, an eccentric English inventor who claimed to have built a working death ray, and, last of all, a young man half her age who called himself a llama, of whom a great deal more in a moment, for he is exactly where the money finally ran out and the strangeness of her life reached its peak. Chapter 9. The Rotten Vegetables and the Garden. In a Havana opera house, in Couture, she sang so far off the key that the audience began to throw vegetables at her, and still she would not stop. That single scene is the whole truth about Ganna Walska, that all the money in the world could not alter, and it played out, in one form or another, on stage after stage, city after city, for years on end. The critics were merciless, and they were also, every one of them, correct. When she attempted the part of Butterfly in New York, the newspaper headline read that Ganna Walska had failed, that her voice had deserted her again, as if it were a servant who kept quitting without notice. A magazine summed her up in 6 cruel words that must have burned worse than any thrown vegetable ever could. Beautiful, wealthy, she has no voice. A great teacher, one of the finest sopranos of the entire age, put it in writing, flatly and without any cruelty at all, that she simply could not teach Ganna Walska to sing. There had been an earlier and even more public humiliation in Chicago, where McCormick had arranged for her to headline an opera, and the conductor resigned rather than stand in front of her voice, and she swept out of the whole production before she ever once appeared on the stage, flinging behind her a line of pure operatic defiance that she was packing her bags that very moment, and that at the end of the season the whole company would be packing theirs. She poured fortune after fortune into that refusal, the flat refusal to accept that the one thing she wanted most in the world was the one thing she could never have. There was never a shortage of teachers willing to take McCormick's money, never a shortage of opera houses willing to book a wealthy woman who would pay her own way onto their stages, and never any power on earth, it turned out, that could put into her throat the sound she heard so clearly and so completely in her own head. And yet the world has a way of remembering such people, whether or not they can ever hit the note. Ganna Walska is widely believed to have been one of the models for the character in the film Citizen Kane, the tone-deaf second wife whom a lonely tycoon bankrolls into a doomed operatic career, going so far as to build her an opera house of her very own. She was not the only model for the character, and the parallel should always be offered as a likeness and never as a settled fact. But the likeness is uncomfortably close, because McCormick really did buy his wife an opera house, which is a thing so extravagant that even the film, reaching for the very summit of a rich man's folly, did not quite dare to invent it. The strangest chapter of her whole strange life belongs to her last serious marriage, and it carries the full eerie undertow that her story has earned. Her sixth husband was a man some 20 years her junior named Theos Bernard, who styled himself the White Lama, one of the first Westerners, he claimed, ever initiated into the secret tantric Buddhism of Tibet. At his urging, she bought a large estate in California and named it Tibetland, meaning it as a retreat and a study center for exiled Tibetan monks, a grand plan he hoped to fund, as men of his particular kind always hoped to, through his rich wife's money. Then the war came and made the monks' passage across the world impossible, and the plan collapsed, and so, in its own time, did the marriage. Bernard went east again in search of a lost manuscript that he believed recorded the hidden years of the life of Christ. And in the autumn of 1947, crossing a high Himalayan pass in the monsoon rains, he was shot off his pony by armed men, and his body was thrown into the river far below and never once recovered. It is a story with every possible trapping of the occult about it: a secret desert wedding, a mystic husband half her age, a murder in the far mountains fought over a hidden gospel. And the grounded explanation is the oldest and the plainest one there is. An older woman with a fortune, a younger man with a scheme, and a scheme that ran clean out of her money. The mysticism was only ever the wrapping around it. The mechanism underneath was exactly the same as it has always been. And then, at the very bottom of it all, the humiliations spent, the husbands gone, the voice at long last surrendered. Ganna Walska did something that not one of the other women in this film ever managed to do. She turned the fire into a garden. The estate she had named Tibetland, she renamed Lotusland, after the lotus pond that lay at its heart. And she spent the last 43 years of her long life, and the last of the husband's fortunes, building it into one of the great gardens of the entire world. She had bought the place in 1941, 37 acres of it, for $40,000, and into it she poured decades and a fortune, laying out garden within garden within garden, thousands of species of plant, a collection of 900 ancient cycads, whole gardens of rare succulents and desert trees, a great working clock made of growing flowers, and everywhere, at the very center of it, the lotus. She sold the jewels, at last, to pay for the plants. In a single auction in 1971, she put 146 pieces under the hammer for over $900,000. And the great yellow diamond alone, the very one a carpet millionaire had draped on a bride half a century before, is said to have fetched something near $1 million all by itself. The diamond that had once dressed the failed diva became, in the very end, the seed money for a bed of prehistoric plants. She had spent her whole long life demanding that the world accept a singer who did not exist, and at the very end of her long life, she was still refusing the very word impossible, insisting, in the phrase her own foundation chose to carve into her memory, that nothing at all was impossible. She died at Lotusland in 1984, 96 years old, and the garden opened to the public, and is counted today among the finest gardens on the whole earth. The woman the critics once called a joke is remembered now, and rightly, as a visionary, though of a garden, and never once of a stage. Here is the collapse image that holds her, and it is the cruelest kind of all, the comic and the tragic locked together in a single frame. Ganna Walska on a stage that she herself had paid for, in a gown that cost a small fortune, being pelted with rotten vegetables while she sings on. Off the key, unstoppable. A woman who could purchase an entire opera house and could not purchase one true note to sing inside it. She heard, all her life long, a music that no one else in the room could ever hear, and she spent tens of millions of dollars trying to force it out of her own throat and into the ears of a world that kept right on throwing vegetables. And when at last she stopped and let the silence come down, she planted a garden over the top of it. And the garden, unlike the voice, at long last obeyed her. Ganna Walska burned tens of millions of dollars on the impossible, on a voice, and salvaged from the ashes a garden that the world now travels to see. The last woman on the ladder burned the largest fortune of all, a full $100 million, and she did it without a shred of illusion and without a moment of shame, on a thing you could still go and stand in front of, right up until the afternoon they blew it up. She did it, and her husband stood right beside her and said it out loud, on purpose, with a smile on his face. Chapter 10. The girl who married the richest man in Philadelphia. She called her own wedding the best and most profitable financial transaction she ever completed, and she meant every single word of it. That line, spoken by the woman herself about the marriage that made her, is the coldest and the clearest piece of self-accounting that anyone in this entire film ever gave, and it belongs to Eva Stotesbury, who burned the greatest fortune of them all, and did it in the full light of day, and left as her only monument the largest pile of rubble in the whole history of American domestic building. She was born in Chicago in 1865, a girl named Lucretia called Eva all her life, and her mother died when she was still an infant. She was not born to the great fortunes she would one day command, and that fact matters more than it might at first seem, because it makes her, like Peggy Hopkins Joyce and like May Yohe, a self-made climber rather than a born heiress, a woman who reached the very summit of American wealth by her own long and patient campaign, and then spent what she found waiting for her there as freely as though she had earned every dollar of it with her own two hands. Her first marriage, in 1889, was to an old family New York man named Oliver Cromwell, a man whose money was thinning even as his pedigree still gleamed. And it gave her 3 children, and 2 of those children would carry her name into the wider history of the century. Her daughter Louise would go on to marry the General Douglas MacArthur. Her son James would marry Doris Duke, the richest girl in the whole world, a union that produced the single most revealing sentence anyone ever spoke about the Stotesbury fortune, though that sentence comes a little further along in the story. Widowed before she was 50, Eva went off to Europe on a steamship, and on the deck of that very ship, in the first days of 1910, she met the man who would make her a legend. His name was Edward Townsend Stotesbury, and he was, quite simply, the richest man in Philadelphia. He was a senior partner in the great banking house of Drexel and Company, and a partner as well in the house of Morgan, which is to say that he stood at the very heart of all American finance, and at the height of the 1920s, his personal fortune was reckoned at something like $100 million, which is to say close to $2 billion in the money of today, throwing off an income of more than $5 million a year, whether he stirred from his chair or not. He had spent more than half a century inside that banking house, risen through it from a young clerk to a master of it, a hard, thin-lipped, keen-eyed man of business whose own motto was to keep your mouth shut and your ears open. There is a story told about him from his early days, that a customer once complained to old Mr. Drexel that the young clerk, Stotesbury, had insulted him, and that either the clerk must go or the customer would, and that Drexel considered this for a moment and then answered, "Then you had better go." He was a widower of long standing, some 16 years her senior, when Eva met him on the deck of that ship, and she married him in January of 1912, and she never afterward disguised, even from herself, even for the public record, what the marriage was truly for. The best and most profitable financial transaction she ever completed. Say a thing like that about your own wedding, coolly, in so many words, and you have told the whole watching world exactly what kind of fire you intend to make of the fortune you have just married into. For all the coldness of that accounting, the marriage itself was warm, And that is part of what makes it so strange to look at. Edward adored her. She called him by a fond pet name, and he called the endless flow of jewels his own way of spoiling her. And by every account, the two of them were genuinely, comfortably happy together in the very middle of the enormous spending. She wrote once of the great house he built for her, that she could never quite find the words for its beauty, that it was so lovely it brought tears to her eyes when she came upon it standing in the moonlight. That is the paradox at the very heart of Eva Stotesbury. She married for money, and said so plainly, for the record, and then fell into something that looked a great deal like love, and the two of them together, the doting old banker and the clear-eyed queen, set about burning his $100 million as happily as any couple ever did anything together. And what a fire she made of it! She had married, in her middle age, into more money than she could ever have imagined as a motherless girl in Chicago, and she set about spending it with the perfect, easy confidence of a woman who felt she had earned every dollar simply by arriving at it. She hired the very best of everything and everyone. She entertained without limit and without pause. She dressed in the great couture houses of Paris and travelled with her own private designer and 3 secretaries in her train. And once, so the story goes, she financed a hunting expedition costing $500,000 for no greater purpose than to gather the skins to make her luggage. But the centerpiece of the whole vast enterprise, the greatest single act of spending in this entire film, rose in the countryside outside Philadelphia over 5 long years, from 1916 to 1921, and it was called Whitemarsh Hall. People called it the American Versailles, and for once the grand phrase was not entirely absurd. It was designed by the finest palace architect in America, its formal gardens laid out by a Frenchman, its rooms filled by the great dealer Duveen with French furniture, and a collection of English portraits, second to almost none in the country, and it was, by the count most often given, a house of 147 rooms, larger than the White House itself, one of the 2 or 3 largest private residences ever built anywhere in the United States. Building it cost several $1 million, running wildly and famously over its every budget, and merely keeping it alive, once it stood, cost something on the order of $1 million every single year. Eva Stotesbury took the fortune of the richest man in Philadelphia, and she began, deliberately, joyfully, and without the smallest apology to anyone, to convert it into the largest and most expensive single object that a private American had ever raised on the face of the earth. She had married the fortune. Now she would build the fire a hearth the size of a small town. Chapter 11. A palace the size of a town. Whitemarsh Hall had 147 rooms, an organ that played itself the moment the front gates were opened, and a bill of roughly $1 million a year, simply to keep the great place breathing. Walk through it slowly, just once, because the sheer scale of it is the scale of the burning, and because almost nothing of it survives now to be walked through at all. Beneath its roofs, there was a movie theatre and a barber shop, a gymnasium and a swimming pool and a bowling alley, a refrigerating plant that could make a full ton of ice in a day, and a button set into the wall of every room to summon one of the staff at any hour. The house had its own power, its own water, its own miniature economy humming away down in the basements, and the staff itself numbered, by the usual count, some 70 gardeners just to keep the terraces and the grounds, and about 45 servants living inside the house to keep the house, a standing workforce larger than many a real factory of the day, an army in livery whose entire purpose on this earth was to keep one aging couple comfortable and one social season brilliant beyond compare. Nor was Whitemarsh Hall the only palace. Down in Palm Beach, she had Edward build her a great Spanish villa called El Mirasol, 37 rooms of it, with a garage for 40 motor cars and a private zoo with monkeys in it. and she kept expanding the place until it stretched clean across the island from the ocean on one side to the waterway on the other. On the coast of Maine, there was a summer house of some 80 rooms, with a servants' wing of 30 rooms all its own, 28 bathrooms, and more than 50 telephones. When the greatest of the three houses first opened, in the autumn of 1921, 800 guests came to the gala. Over the years of her long reign, across all three of these palaces, Eva Stotesbury is reckoned to have entertained something like 100,000 guests. She was far more than merely rich. She made herself the reigning social queen of two American cities at once, Philadelphia and Palm Beach, running a seasonal circuit between her houses the way a monarch progresses between capitals, spring and autumn in the great house near Philadelphia, winter in the Spanish villa at Palm Beach, high summer by the sea in Maine. And she paid for that crown out of the banking fortune, season upon season, guest upon guest, $1 million a year and more, just to keep a single one of the three houses standing ready to receive the world. She entertained lavishly straight through the years of Prohibition, so lavishly that the temperance women wrote letters of complaint about the drink and the smoke and the sheer extravagance of it all, and she did not care in the slightest, because the entire point of the exercise was to be seen not to care. Her closest companion in all of it was a woman cut from the very same cloth, the owner of the Hope Diamond herself, and between the two of them, at a single dinner, they wore enough hard, bright stone to buy a small town. Society in those years was a kind of soft warfare, conducted with orchestras and menus and jewels instead of guns, and Eva Stotesbury fought it the way her husband fought in the markets, which is to say to win. And she won it for a full quarter of a century, the uncontested queen of two cities, her invitations the most sought after in all of America. The cost of that long reign was the fortune itself, poured out season by season by season, and she paid the cost gladly, without a backward glance, because the reign was the whole point of the thing, the object all the money had been for. $100 million in the end bought her the right to be, for 25 unbroken years, the single most important woman in any room she chose to walk into. And then the money ran out, and the rooms closed against her, one by one by one. She loved fine stones with the trained eye of a real expert, and the newspapers said that she could discuss the merits of a gem with the knowledge of a dealer, and that every stone she owned was of the finest water. There was an emerald of some 34 carats, a great Colombian stone with a provenance that ran through the hands of half the famous women of the age, having passed, before it ever reached her throat, through the collection of the very woman who then owned the Hope Diamond. There were pearls, a rope of natural pearls 7 strands deep, of a kind that in that era were valued above even the finest diamonds, since a perfectly matched natural pearl necklace could take a lifetime and a fortune to assemble, one small bead at a time. And over all of it, over the emerald and the pearls and the 147 rooms, there presided the most extraordinary attitude toward money that any of these families ever put on the record, an attitude of open, boastful, and entirely deliberate destruction. It was Edward himself who spoke it aloud, and his words are the plain thesis of this entire film, delivered by the very man whose fortune was being burned, and delivered with a smile. In 1936, as his stepson James prepared to marry Doris Duke, the richest girl in the world, the old banker told the young man plainly that it was a very good thing indeed that he had married so well, because he would be getting very little from the Stotesbury fortune. "I made my fortune," Edward said, "and I am going to squander it myself." There it is, the whole of it, in a single sentence. Not lost, not stolen, not gambled away in a panic, squandered on purpose, with real pleasure, by a man who calmly announced his intention and a wife who was the tireless engine that carried it out to the very last dollar. He is even said to have vowed to spend the very last of it before he died, rather than hand a single cent of it to the taxman. When the industrialist Henry Ford toured the Great Palace, he remarked dryly that it was a fine experience to see how the rich live. Eva's own son said something a good deal sharper and truer, that his mother ran her enormous household with more efficiency than any factory he had ever set foot inside. Hold those two remarks together in your mind, and you have the whole paradox of Whitemarsh Hall standing before you. A machine of superb and tireless efficiency built for no purpose on this earth except the spending of money. A factory whose only product was the fire itself. 70 gardeners and 45 servants and a self-playing organ, all of it labouring, day after brilliant day, to burn $100 million as beautifully and as thoroughly as any fortune has ever been burned. Chapter 12. $100 million gone. When Edward Stotesbury died in 1938, the men who opened his books found $4 million where $100 million had once stood. He was 89 years old, and he had been as good as his word to the very end. He had made his fortune, and he had squandered it himself, exactly as he promised. And what he left his widow was the cool ash of it, $4 million where the newspapers had once counted 100. A fall so steep that it reads less like a loss than like a demolition carried out deliberately over 20 years, one brilliant party at a time. Within weeks of his death, the reckoning reached the servants. Of the 70 who had kept Whitemarsh Hall alive, 66 were let go at a stroke. The great machine of superb efficiency was being switched off, wing by wing and room by room, and the fire, after a quarter of a century of burning, was at last going out. For a woman who had run 3 palaces and commanded an army of servants, the arithmetic of the end must have been a strange and quiet horror. $1 million a year to keep a single one of the houses breathing, and the income to pay for it simply gone. There was no one catastrophe to point a finger at. No fire, no theft, no single crash that carried it off in an afternoon. There was only the slow, patient discovery, account by account and season by season, that a fortune which had seemed as fixed and permanent as the ground underfoot had in fact been spent, methodically and joyfully, for 25 years, and that spending on that scale, kept up long enough, will drain even the deepest well in America. The bankers who came at last to sort out the estate found a great and famous fortune worn down to a stub, and an old widow rattling around inside a palace she could no longer afford to light at night. The crash of 1929 had begun the ebb, though the spending had barely slowed at first, so deep was the reserve behind it. But the long, grinding slide of the 1930s was merciless to a way of life that cost $1 million a year merely to stand still, and by 1932, the doors of Whitemarsh Hall had begun to close for the season and stay closed. There is a small, strange detail from those anxious years that catches the whole mood of them perfectly. The installation, amid real fears of kidnapping, of machine guns inside the Palace of Pleasure. The house that had been built to receive 800 guests at a single gala was now quietly arming itself against the world beyond its own gates. And the age of the open door, of the 100,000 guests and the organ playing itself to the arrivals, was ending inside its own walls even before the last of the money finished draining away. After Edward's death, Eva could no longer sustain the thing she had built, and one by one the palaces went under. She sold the art and the antiques and the real estate, the whole great collection her husband had bought from Duveen, the English portraits and the French furniture, dispersed to the auction rooms. Some of it found a strange second life. The great collection of English portraits that Duveen had hung along the walls, the Reynolds and the row of Romneys, went in part toward a public museum in Philadelphia, so that the very pictures a Gilded Age banker had bought to prove that his family had finally arrived ended up on walls where anyone at all could walk in off the street and look at them for nothing. Even in the last years, the spending had kept its own strange generosity. When the shipbuilders of the coast fell on hard times in the depths of the Depression, the Stotesburys had simply commissioned another yacht, one more great vessel they did not need in the slightest, purely to keep the men in work through a hard winter. It was the reflex of a whole lifetime, to meet every trouble in the world by spending money at it until it went away, and it worked right up until the single moment when the money itself was the trouble, and then it worked no longer. During the war, the empty American Versailles served one last, secret purpose. It held the greatest treasures of the Metropolitan Museum of New York, hidden away in its deep vaults against the real fear of German bombs falling on Manhattan, so that for a few strange years, the dead hostesses' shuttered ballrooms stood silent guard over the art of a whole nation, dark and locked and stacked with masterpieces that no guest would ever see. Then in 1943, the house itself was sold for around $167,000, a palace that had cost several million, now going for the price of a good suburban street. And it passed to a chemical company to be used, of all things on earth, as a research laboratory. The Spanish villa down in Palm Beach came down in the 1950s. The great summer house on the coast of Maine came down in the same decade, pulled apart to clear the ground for a ferry terminal. Eva herself, leaving Philadelphia at the last, is said to have delivered a line as final as a heavy door swinging shut. This would be her last visit, she said, and she never wanted to see the place again. She died in Palm Beach in 1946, 80 years old, having outlived her husband, her fortune, and very nearly the whole shining world that had once made her a queen of two cities. And here is where the fire leaves its clearest and its most terrible mark upon the earth, in the fate of the great house itself, which is the collapse image not only of Eva Stotesbury, but of this entire film. The chemical company eventually left. No one on earth wanted a 147-room palace, and no one alive could any longer afford to keep one standing. And so, through the 1960s and on into the 70s, the American Versailles stood empty and rotting in the suburbs of Philadelphia, looted, vandalized, its marble stripped from the walls, its windows gone, its grand rooms thrown open to the rain and the weather, a genuine haunted colossus, a ruined Versailles standing inside living memory, the kind of place local children dared each other to creep into after dark. Then, in the spring of 1980, the demolition crews came at last and brought it down in a single afternoon, the largest house ever deliberately destroyed anywhere in America. And on the very ground where the palace had stood, where 800 guests had once come to a gala and the organ had played itself when the great gates swung open, a developer raised a tract of ordinary suburban houses and named the development, without the faintest flicker of irony, Stotesbury Estates. The $100 million had become a street sign standing over a subdivision, bearing the name of the very woman who had burned it all down, which raises the one question this whole film has been building toward and has left, until this moment, unanswered. What did any of it buy? Chapter 13. The things the fire could not touch. Every fortune in this story is gone, and yet you can still go and stand in front of what it bought, behind glass. That is the strange consolation, and the far stranger cruelty, waiting at the end of all 5 of these lives, and it is the answer, or at least the better half of the answer, to the question that the rubble of Whitemarsh Hall left hanging in the air. The money is ash. The palaces are demolished, or subdivided, or turned altogether to dust. But the hard, gleaming objects that these women bankrupted themselves to hold, the jewels above every other thing, survived each and every one of them, and survive still, immortal in their lit cases, admired by streams of strangers who file past them all day long, priced higher now than the whole estates they came out of. It is a strange kind of afterlife, and it is worth standing inside it for a moment. A woman spends her health, her marriage, her good name, and at the last, her whole fortune, all to set a single stone at her throat for a handful of glittering years. And then the stone goes on without her, gathering crowds she will never once see, wearing her ruin as lightly as it had once worn her triumph. The people who file slowly past the lit case do not come for her. They come for the diamond, for its great size and its cold fire and its famous price. And the small printed card beside it, if it names her at all, names her the way a road names the little town it passes through, briefly, in passing, on the way to somewhere else. The stone was always the point of it. The museums quietly agree. The woman was only ever the setting the stone was mounted in. Go to the National Museum of Natural History in Washington, and there, behind its thick glass, is the Hope Diamond, the great dark blue stone that May Yohe married and may only ever have worn in paste. The stone that outlived her poverty and her scrubbing and her $16 relief job by whole lifetimes. And that will outlive us too. It draws great streams of visitors from all over the world, come to stand in front of it every day of the year. And hardly one of them in 1,000 has ever once heard the name of the American showgirl who staked her whole life on it and lost. Go a little further in that same city, and you may find another stone lifted straight out of this story. The flawless, octagonal diamond that Peggy Hopkins Joyce once wore at her own throat, and the jewelers called the largest perfect diamond in the world, glowing its cold blue fire under the museum lights now for school children who will never hear her name either. Go up to the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and there, among the founding treasures of its great costume collection, are the feather-light shoes of Rita de Acosta Lydig, each single one still cradled in its velvet, worn now by no one, worth more than she died with, the perfection she starved herself to achieve at last, permanently and completely achieved, though only after she was safely dead and could no longer take the smallest pleasure in it. Ganna Walska's great yellow diamond was sold off to feed her garden, and the garden itself is now a public wonder that thousands travel across the world to walk through each year. And the Stotesbury emerald, the 34-carat stone that passed through the hands of half the doomed heiresses of the whole age, came up for auction as recently as a few years ago and sold, all on its own, for very nearly $1 million, which is to say for a good deal more than remained of Edward Stotesbury's entire $100 million fortune within his own lifetime. This is the thing the fire could not touch, and it is worth following all the way to its end. The women were the fuel. The stones were what the fire could not burn. Each woman, in her turn, poured a whole fortune into a single great object and wore it at the very summit of her life. And then, when everything else around her had gone to ash, the object simply slipped free of her fingers and moved on, cool and indifferent, to the next hand, the next vault, the next lit glass case. The diamond does not remember the throat it once hung at. It keeps its fire, and it keeps its price. And the woman who paid for both of those things with everything she had becomes, in the end, a line of small type on the label beneath it, if she is named on the label at all. They spent their whole fortunes in order to possess these things. What the long record actually shows is that the things possessed them instead, outlasted them, and forgot them, and are more famous now, most of them, than the women who wore them ever managed to become in life. There is the deepest irony of the jewel houses that fed this age. They sold permanence, and they delivered it, but the permanence was always for the stone, and never once for the woman who bought it. The houses that sold that permanence were the quiet engines of the whole age, and they knew exactly what it was they were selling. The great dealer who filled these palaces with old masters had built his own fortune on a single cold observation, that Europe had all the art and America had all the money, and that a clever man might stand forever in the middle of the two and take his commission on the flow. The jeweler who sold the Hope diamond into American hands understood the very same thing from the other end, and when a merely beautiful stone would not move, he simply invented a curse for it and sold the curse along with the carats, because a story, he had learned, was worth a great deal more than a flawless facet. These men trafficked in permanence and in legend, and they were right about both. The stones outlasted every one of their owners. The legends outlasted even the stones. And the women who paid for both, with everything they had, are the one part of the whole transaction that did not endure. Chapter 14. What the spending really was. It is easy to call these women foolish, and it is also the laziest single thing that anyone could possibly say about them. Foolish is the word the men who wrote the first drafts of their lives reached for, and it explains precisely nothing, because it treats the burning as an accident, a mere failure of good sense, when the burning was in truth the most deliberate and, in a terrible way, the most rational thing about any of them. To see it clearly, you have to look hard at what the age actually offered a woman, and at what, in the very same breath, it withheld from her, because the gap between those two things is the whole of the answer. These were women handed the greatest fortunes on earth and permitted to control almost nothing else at all about their own lives. The law and the custom of their day gave a woman her beauty and her marriageability as her only real capital, and then arranged matters with great care so that even the money which came to her came filtered through the men she married, held in trust, managed by fathers and by husbands and by lawyers, hers to enjoy and only very rarely hers to command. There was a whole market built on top of that arrangement, the marriage market, where American money was traded for European rank as openly as grain, and a girl was the thing being sold across the counter. The prices in that market were real, and they were known. A mother in New York knew what a duke cost the way her husband knew the price of railway shares, and a girl with enough money standing behind her could be made a duchess, or a countess, or even a princess, if the title on offer was hungry enough and old enough and poor enough to sell itself. The daughters went out across the ocean like so much cargo, with the settlements written in hard figures into the marriage contracts, and some of them were happy in it, and most of them were not. And every last one of them learned very quickly that a coronet bought with a father's money did not come with any power of its own attached to it. They had been the currency in the transaction, and currency does not get to spend itself. It only ever gets spent. Which is exactly why, when these women found the one door the age had left standing ajar, the door marked spending, they went straight through it and never once looked back. She could not build a railroad. She could not run the bank. She could not stand for office, or plead a case at law, or preach a sermon from a pulpit, or command a regiment in the field. She could not, in almost any of the ways that a man of her own class could, act directly upon the world and leave behind a mark that said, plainly and forever, I was here. I did this thing. This is mine. And I made it. What she could do, the one great lever she was allowed to pull without any limit at all, was spend. Spending was the single wide field of action left standing open to her. And so spending is exactly what these women turned into an art and a weapon and a signature, and in the end, a form of authorship. May Yohe authored her own scandal and then sold tickets to it. Rita de Acosta Lydig authored a life so beautiful that the Metropolitan Museum keeps the evidence of it under glass to this very day. Ganna Walska refused a voice by her own throat and by the whole listening world, authored instead a garden that the world now travels to see. Eva Stotesbury authored a palace larger than the White House. Each of them took the one thing that an age of narrow doors had left open to her, and drove a whole fortune straight through it, and made, out of pure and total expenditure, the mark that the world would not otherwise have let her make at all. And they knew it, most of them, a good deal better than we tend to give them credit for. Peggy Hopkins Joyce did not stumble into the largest perfect diamond in the world by some happy accident, and Rita de Acosta Lydig did not fail to notice that a woman who owns hundreds of pairs of shoes has said something very loud about herself to a world that would not otherwise stop to listen. These were not women sleepwalking gently toward their ruin. They were women who had looked hard and clearly at the terms on offer: a decorative life, a fortune managed by other hands, a coronet with no power at all inside it, and who had each decided, in her own way and her own time, that if the world would only permit them to spend, then they would spend so magnificently, so recklessly, so unforgettably, that the spending itself became the achievement, the thing said, the mark made and signed. It was the one art the age would allow them to practice, and every one of them practiced it like a master of the form. And here, if you have followed these 5 women all the way to this point, is the thing to sit with for a moment. The thing that turns them from a gallery of cautionary tales into something a great deal harder and more human. Every one of them owned more money than almost anyone else alive, and not one of them was permitted to be, in the full and ordinary sense of the word, the author of her own life. So they authored the one thing they were handed. They spent. They spent enormously, spectacularly, ruinously, because the spending was the only sentence in the whole language of their lives that they were ever once allowed to write themselves, and so they wrote it as large as they possibly could, in diamonds and in palaces and in whole opera houses and in hundreds of pairs of shoes, and then they signed their names beneath it, and then it burned. That is the gap this entire film has been standing in front of all along, the gap between the sheer, staggering size of these fortunes and the smallness of the lives that the age would otherwise have permitted the women who happened to hold them. The money was vast beyond any counting. The freedom was almost nothing at all. And into that narrow, brilliant, ruinous gap, they poured every last thing they had and set it alight. Because a fire, whatever else it may be, is at the very least a thing that you have made yourself, and a thing that the whole watching world cannot help but see. Chapter 15. The Monuments and the Tide. The tide that carried all these fortunes out to sea was already turning while the parties were still going and the orchestras still played. The Gilded Age had built as though the money would go on rising forever, and it had failed to notice, or had firmly refused to notice, that every tide which comes in must one day turn and go back out again. The crash of 1929 and the long depression that followed hard behind it were that ebb, the whole gilded ocean draining away at once, and the private fires in this film and the great public catastrophe met and mingled in the very same few years, until it becomes genuinely hard to say where the one of them ended and the other began. Rita de Acosta Lydig died within days of the crash, the last and most refined creature of the whole aesthetic dying at the very hour that its world died all around her. Eva Stotesbury watched $100 million fall to 4 in the wreckage of the 30s, and May Yohe, at the very bottom of that same grey decade, sat in a Boston relief office begging for $16.50 a week. The women had burned their private fortunes from within, and the age had burned its great public fortune from without, and the ash of both of them in the end. settled down over the very same ruined years. There is a temptation, looking back from a distance of 100 years, to read the crash as a punishment, as the tidy moral of the story arriving right on schedule to collect what these women owed. Resist it. The depression did not fall on the extravagant alone. It fell on the sober and the thrifty and the poor with far greater weight, on millions of families who had never once wasted $1 in their lives, and it would be a cheap and a false comfort to pretend that Rita de Acosta Lydig happened to die in the very week of the crash, because some great ledger in the sky had finally chosen to balance her account. She died because she was ill and old and spent. The tide that carried off her fortune was the very same tide that carried off everyone's, rich and poor together, and it was blind, as every tide is blind, and it did not care in the slightest how beautifully she had burned. What is left of any of them now is a long study in absence, and the palaces are the plainest and the hardest lesson of it. Whitemarsh Hall is a subdivision. The Palm Beach Villa is gone, the main house is gone, and of the 3 great courts over which Eva Stotesbury once reigned as a queen, there survives almost nothing at all but a few limestone pillars, a gatehouse turned into somebody's ordinary home, and a name on a quiet suburban street. The great houses of the Gilded Age were meant to be the most permanent thing that their builders ever made, the proof, written out in marble and in limestone, that the family had at long last arrived to stay for good, and they turned out to be among the very least permanent things of all, demolished, subdivided, forgotten, while the small, hard jewels that the same families bought went right on gleaming quietly in their cases through all of it. The monuments that the age was proudest of are gone. The little trinkets survived them, everyone. You can measure a whole age by what it manages to keep. And this one kept the wrong things, or rather, it kept the things it never meant to keep and lost the things it had built to last forever. The mansions were the boast, the proof, the whole point of the exercise, and the mansions are gone. The jewels were the small change, the ornament, the afterthought pinned to the front of a gown, and the jewels are in the museums now, drawing the very crowds the mansions were built to draw. Somewhere in that reversal lies the truest thing these 5 lives have to teach us, that permanence cannot be built on purpose, that the harder a family tries to carve its name into the face of the world, the more surely the world sands it smooth again, and that what survives at the end is almost never the thing anyone set out to leave behind. What survives, it turns out, is the story. There is a lesson buried in that about what actually endures in this world, and it is very nearly the exact opposite of the lesson the builders had meant so carefully to leave behind them. And it would be a great comfort to call all of this a closed chapter now, a vanished world, a thing that happened only once, long ago, to other people, in sepia and gaslight and old newsprint. It would also be entirely false. The particular fortunes are gone, and the coronets and the dollar princesses have gone down with them. But the deeper machine has never once stopped running, the machine that builds fortunes, meant to last forever, and then quietly hands the spending of them down to heirs the money has trained for nothing else in the whole of their lives. The names change with each new generation. The industries change, coal and steel and railroads giving way in their turn to other things entirely. The stones change hands again at the auctions. The palaces rise once more in new places, under new architects, in glass now instead of limestone. And one day, in their own turn, they too will stand empty and be pulled down, and someone will raise a tract of ordinary houses on the cleared ground and give it the old grand name for the sound of it, which brings us back, one final time, to a spring afternoon and a palace coming down. Chapter 16. the same fire at the end of each of them. Return, one last time, to the spring of 1980, and the largest house ever pulled down in America, coming down in a single afternoon. Stand there on that ground, where the organ once played itself as the gates swung open, where 800 guests once came to a gala, where 100,000 guests were entertained across the long years, and where now there is only a street sign reading Stotesbury Estates, standing over a row of perfectly ordinary suburban homes. That is where every single road in this film has been leading, all along, because that patch of paved suburban ground is what $100 million finally bought. And it is the same thing, in the very end, that all of them bought. For they are all, the 5 of them, one story told 5 times over, in steadily rising amounts. May Yohe was handed the spending of an old English fortune, and she burned it down to nothing, and it left her a scrub woman turned away from a relief line for the want of a country. Peggy Hopkins Joyce seized fortune after fortune out of the hands of ruined men, and she burned every one of them to the ground, and they left her a diamond in a glass case and a brand new word in the dictionary. Rita de Acosta Lydig was given 2 whole American fortunes, and she burned them so beautifully that the smoke never once showed above the roofline, and they left her a pair of shoes in a museum and a whispered question about a Spanish fan. Ganna Walska took tens of millions from 6 husbands and burned it all chasing a single true note she could not sing, and it left her a garden of ancient plants that the world now crosses whole oceans to see. And Eva Stotesbury was handed the greatest fortune of them all, and she burned it in the open, on purpose, with her own husband standing beside her and cheering her on, and it left her a subdivision named for her over the grave of a palace. 5 women, 5 fortunes built to outlast their builders, and the same fire at the end of each of them, and the same small handful of hard, bright objects raked cool out of the ashes, surviving, indifferent, behind glass. Think of what each of them actually left behind, and the pattern in it comes very close to frightening. May Yohe left a legend she had written herself, and a grave in the open sea. Peggy Hopkins Joyce left a single word that outlived her by a century and will outlive us. Rita de Acosta Lydig left a pair of feather-light shoes and a museum full of the proof of her. Ganna Walska left a garden that opens its gates to strangers every morning of the year. And Eva Stotesbury left a name on a suburban street sign and the memory of the largest house that ever fell. Not one of the 5 of them left the money, because the money was never once the thing they were making. The money was only ever the fuel for it. What they made, each in her own way and at her own terrible price, out of the burning of it, was a single unforgettable gesture flung in the face of an age that had meant them to be quiet and decorative and forgotten. And the gesture, it turns out, is the one thing that remains. Rita de Acosta Lydig, dying with nothing at all to her name, had said that she could go without food, but that she would not be without her white flowers. And in that one quiet line lies the whole strange dignity of all 5 of them. Women who had decided, long before the money ever ran out, exactly what they were willing to burn for, and then burned for it without a single word of apology to anyone. The men who built the fortunes wanted above all else to be remembered for the fortunes, and the fortunes are gone. The women who spent them are remembered instead for the spending, and the spending, it turns out, is the thing that lasts. The palace alive forever in the story, if not in the stone, the diamond behind the glass, the shoe in its velvet cradle, the garden in its endless bloom, the name carved into a quiet suburban street. What the fire left behind was never once the money. It was the idea of these women burning it, and that, in the very end, is the one thing that would not burn. The last word belongs to the one of them who fell the very furthest, and who never once claimed to regret the fall. Near the end of her long life, poor, scrubbing floors in a strange city, the diamond and the coronet 40 years gone from her, May Yohe looked back over the whole of it, the lord and the affairs and the plantations and the ruin. And she said simply that she had done pretty nearly everything in her life except theft and murder. But that, thank God, whatever she had done, her heart had been in it. 5 fortunes, 5 fires. And not one of these women, at the very end of all of it, wishing that she had merely kept the money and stayed small and safe and forgotten. Now, before you go, one last thing from me. If this story held you all the way through to here, subscribe and stay close, because there are more of these women waiting in the dark, more fortunes and more fires still to come. And tell me, down in the comments, which of the 5 you would have been, the one who burned it all on beauty, or the one who burned it all on a crown. And while you are there, tell me where in the world you are watching from tonight. I read them, everyone, and you are the reason I keep telling these stories.